25 November 1942. Western Russia. The forests and frozen marshes west of Azov lie silent under a low grey sky as artillery clocks synchronize across hundreds of kilometers. Red Army formations press forward in darkness, engines idling, infantry crouched in tree lines, assault guns masked beneath branches. The Stavka has issued a directive with absolute confidence. German Army Group Center is about to be shattered. The intelligence says the enemy is thin. The plan says the breakthrough will be swift. The timing says victory is inevitable. What waits ahead is not weakness, but a trap built over a year of blood and concrete. They were wrong. The Azov, Vyazma salient has been a knife aimed at Moscow since October 1941. Its position matters more than any stretch of frozen ground in Europe. From here, German artillery can reach supply corridors feeding the Soviet capital. From here, armored reserves can launch renewed offensives toward the city that refused to fall. For Stalin, the salient is intolerable. For Zhukov, it is a wound that must be cauterized. For the Red Army, it is unfinished business soaked in losses that have never been fully counted. By late 1942, the war appears to be turning. At Stalingrad, Operation Uranus has encircled the German Sixth Army. The Wehrmacht is bleeding in the south, and Soviet confidence surges. Stavka believes Army Group Center has stripped its reserves to save Paulus. Intelligence summaries describe exhausted divisions, under-strength panzer units, brittle morale. Maps show German lines stretched thin across forests, rivers, and swamp. The conclusion is clear. Strike now, crush the salient, and the road to Smolensk opens. Germany will be forced onto the defensive across the entire Eastern Front. Operation Mars is authorized with the same strategic weight as Stalingrad. This is not a diversion. This is not secondary. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops are committed, over 2,000 tanks, more than 20,000 guns and mortars. The Kalinin Front under Colonel General Ivan Konev and the Western Front under General Georgy Zhukov will attack simultaneously from multiple axes. The German Ninth Army under Generaloberst Walter Model is to be encircled, cut off, annihilated. On paper, the plan is overwhelming. Breakthrough groups will punch through German defenses along the Osuga River, the Vazuza River, near Belai, near Sishevka. Once armor penetrates the tactical zone, mobile formations will fan out, severing supply routes, collapsing resistance from the rear. The terrain is difficult but manageable. The weather is cold but familiar. Soviet doctrine calls for shock, mass, relentless pressure. There is confidence in numbers, confidence in momentum, confidence in lessons learned since 1941. What the plan underestimates is the enemy. Walter Model has turned the Azov salient into a fortress system unrivaled on the Eastern Front. For months, German engineers and infantry have dug layered defenses through forest and frozen soil. Trenches are deep and interconnected. Bunkers are reinforced with logs and steel. Minefields overlap artillery kill zones. Anti-tank guns are sited with perfect fields of fire across narrow approaches. Every village is wired for demolition. Every forest road is registered by artillery. Model expects an attack. He does not know the date, but he knows the direction. He knows the doctrine. He prepares accordingly. As Soviet artillery opens fire before dawn, the bombardment rolls across German lines with thunderous force. Entire sections of forest disappear in geysers of earth and snow. Forward bunkers collapse. Telephone lines snap. For minutes, it seems the intelligence was correct. Soviet infantry surge forward behind creeping barrages, boots slipping on ice, breath freezing in scarves. Tanks push through narrow corridors cleared by sappers. Red flares mark objectives. The first defensive belt buckles in places. Reports flow back to headquarters of progress, of captured trenches, of prisoners taken. Then the fire shifts. German second-line positions emerge intact. Machine guns open from flanks that were never marked on Soviet maps. Anti-tank guns fire from hidden revetments at point-blank range. Tanks erupt into flame on frozen riverbanks, blocking the advance behind them. Artillery concentrations slam into Soviet assembly areas with pre-registered accuracy. Units lose cohesion within minutes. Radios fail in the cold. Runners do not return. The terrain turns against the attackers. Forests funnel armor into narrow paths. Swamps, frozen on the surface, collapse under weight. Vehicles bog down, immobilized, easy targets. Engineers attempting to clear mines are cut down by interlocking fire. Infantry assaults stall in knee-deep snow under machine gun bursts that never cease. The German defense does not retreat. It absorbs, bends, and seals the breaches. By nightfall on the first day, casualties are already staggering. Entire companies are reduced to handfuls of men. Tank brigades report losses exceeding 50%. Ammunition expenditures surpass projections by multiples, yet orders from above remain unchanged. The breakthrough must be achieved. Momentum must not be lost. Reserves are fed forward into the same corridors of fire. The plan said the enemy was weak. Reality delivers a defense designed to destroy mass with precision. As darkness settles over the forests west of Argev, the battlefield glows with burning armor and shattered trees. Snow is stained black with oil and blood. Wounded men lie frozen where medics cannot reach them. German counterattacks probe the flanks, sealing gaps, isolating forward units that believe relief is coming. It does not. This is only the first day, and the operation has just begun. Dawn breaks on 26 November 1942 beneath a ceiling of low cloud and drifting snow. The battlefield does not reset. It compounds. Soviet forward units that advanced during the night find themselves cut off, ammunition low, radios silent. Some dig in where they stand. Others attempt to push forward on foot, believing the breakthrough must be close. Behind them, fresh formations move up along the same forest tracks, already clogged with wrecked tanks and frozen bodies. At Western Front headquarters, reports arrive fragmented and contradictory. Some sectors claim limited penetration. Others go silent entirely. Zhukov presses for continuation. The operational logic remains intact on the map. German resistance is assessed as localized. The salient must be severed before the enemy can redeploy reserves from other sectors. Time is now the critical factor. Every hour that passes without a collapse is an hour that favors model. On the ground, German reserves are already moving. The Ninth Army operates with a defensive doctrine refined through a year of survival. Model does not counterattack blindly. He waits for Soviet units to exhaust themselves against fixed positions, then commits mobile groups to restore the line. Kampfgruppen formed from panzer grenadiers, assault guns, and engineers strike exposed flanks, cutting supply routes only a few kilometers behind the front. Soviet spearheads find themselves fighting in three directions at once, unable to advance or withdraw. Near Belai, Soviet armor pushes toward the town through a narrow corridor between forest and swamp. The advance looks promising for several hours. Then German artillery opens from concealed positions on higher ground. Shells detonate among the tanks with devastating accuracy. Smoke and snow obscure vision. Drivers lose orientation. Vehicles bunch together, presenting perfect targets. German 88mm guns fire from tree lines at ranges measured in hundreds of meters. Each hit is catastrophic. Turrets are blown free. Crews burn inside steel hulls that become ovens. Infantry attempts to follow, but machine gun fire scythes through the trees. Mines detonate beneath boots and tracks alike. Engineers clearing paths are killed faster than replacements arrive. Commanders order repeated frontal assaults, convinced that the enemy must be nearing collapse. Instead, each push is absorbed and repelled with disciplined violence. The weather worsens. Temperatures drop well below freezing. Weapons malfunction. Oil thickens in engines. Wounded men freeze to death before evacuation can be organized. Supply columns struggle to reach the front along roads under constant artillery observation. Horses collapse in harness. Trucks slide into ditches and block entire routes. Artillery units run low on shells at the very moment when fire support is most desperately needed. By the third day, Soviet losses reach levels that would have halted operations earlier in the war. But the strategic pressure from above does not ease. Stalingrad is unfolding favorably. Success there must be matched here. Failure at Argev would expose Moscow again. There is no acceptable alternative. German morale, meanwhile, hardens. Soldiers know they are fighting for prepared positions. They know every approach. They trust their commanders. The defense becomes a grinding machine. Each Soviet attack reveals itself hours in advance through sound, movement, and radio intercepts. Artillery concentrations are called down with calm efficiency. Counterattacks are limited, precise, devastating. In the forests along the Vazhuza River, Soviet units manage a shallow penetration, only to be surrounded within 48 hours. Attempts at resupply by air fail in the weather. Ammunition runs out. Wounded accumulate. Commanders debate whether to break out or hold. Orders to stand fast arrive late or not at all. When German infantry closes in, the fighting becomes hand-to-hand among frozen trenches and shattered trees. The numbers continue to escalate, tanks lost by the hundreds, infantry casualties counted in the tens of thousands. Time is slipping away. The plan assumed momentum. Momentum never arrives. The operation grinds forward not through success, but through inertia. And the forest does not release those who enter it. By early December, the battlefield has settled into a pattern of relentless attrition that favors the defender at every turn. Snow falls almost constantly now, muffling sound, concealing movement, and hiding the dead beneath shallow drifts. Soviet units rotate forward into positions already saturated with loss, inheriting shattered trenches and the unspoken knowledge of what waits ahead. Orders arrive insisting that the decisive breakthrough is imminent. Maps are updated with arrows that do not reflect the ground beneath them. German defenses deepen with each passing day. Model shortens his lines where necessary, abandoning exposed salients only to strengthen new positions a few kilometers back. These withdrawals are deliberate, executed under cover of artillery, and misread by Soviet intelligence as signs of collapse. Each time the Red Army surges forward, expecting pursuit, it collides with another prepared belt of fire. The plan said the enemy would not have time to reorganize. Reality delivers a defense that anticipates every move. Near Sishevka, Soviet rifle divisions are ordered to assault across open ground swept by interlocking machine gun fire. Artillery preparation is shortened to preserve ammunition. Infantry advances in waves, spacing reduced to maintain cohesion in poor visibility. German guns open as soon as the men rise from the snow. Entire platoons are cut down before reaching the first wire. Survivors press on, crawling, dragging the wounded, closing the distance by meters measured in lives. Tank brigades attempt to support the attacks, but the ground no longer allows maneuver. Frozen ruts channel vehicles into predictable paths. Anti-tank guns wait. Assault guns fire from hull-down positions barely visible against the trees. German infantry teams armed with magnetic mines and bundled charges move forward under covering fire, targeting immobilized Soviet armor. Close combat becomes routine. Steel against steel. Men against machines. Command and control on the Soviet side deteriorates. Radio nets fragment. Senior officers move forward to restore order and are killed or wounded in exposed command posts. Regimental commanders assume divisional responsibilities. Junior officers lead battalions. Messages are carried by runners who often do not return. The fog of war thickens until even adjacent units lose contact with one another. Behind the front, logistical strain becomes critical. Ammunition dumps are shelled. Medical stations overflow. Evacuation routes freeze solid. Frostbite cases rival combat wounds. Replacement units arrive already exhausted from marches through snow and darkness. They are committed immediately, often without reconnaissance, into battles already lost by the terrain. German losses are real and mounting, but they are absorbed within a defensive framework designed for endurance. Units rotate through prepared shelters. Supply lines remain intact. Artillery ammunition flows steadily. Morale holds, reinforced by the knowledge that every Soviet assault weakens the enemy more than it weakens the defense. By mid-December, Soviet formations in several sectors are combat ineffective. Tank corps report fewer than a dozen operational vehicles. Rifle divisions are reduced to fractions of their authorized strength. Yet attacks continue, driven by the belief that stopping now would render the sacrifices meaningless. The clock has become an enemy of its own. In the frozen forests west of Azhev, the operation has lost its original shape. What was meant to be an encirclement has become a series of isolated, desperate engagements, each feeding into the next without resolution. The enemy does not retreat. The lines do not break. And the cost continues to rise, measured not in kilometers gained, but in formations consumed. As December grinds on, the distinction between offensive and defense blurs into something more primitive. Soviet units no longer advance according to timetable or axis. They advance because they are ordered to, because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing, because the weight of expectation from Moscow presses harder than German fire. The calendar turns, but the situation does not improve. German countermeasures become increasingly surgical. Rather than broad counterattacks, Model authorizes localized strikes designed to amputate Soviet penetrations before they can deepen. At night, assault detachments move silently through forest trails known only to locals and reconnaissance patrols. They infiltrate rear areas, destroy command posts, capture maps, sever telephone lines. By morning, Soviet spearheads discover their flanks gone and their supply routes under enemy control. In the Belai sector, a Soviet mechanized group pushes forward several kilometers under cover of snowfall. For hours, radio silence from German positions fuels optimism. Then artillery falls with crushing precision. The shells do not walk forward. They land directly on assembly areas. German forward observers, hidden in treetops and church ruins, have tracked every movement. Tanks that survived earlier engagements are immobilized in minutes. Infantry scatters into the forest, pursued by fire that seems to come from all directions at once. The psychological toll deepens. Soldiers speak of an enemy that cannot be dislodged, of guns that never miss, of forests that kill without warning. Sleep becomes impossible. Exposure gnaws at the body. Hunger sharpens. The wounded cry out through the night, their voices fading as the cold claims them. Medics work until their hands are numb, then keep working anyway. At higher command levels, the disconnect widens. Reports are filtered, softened, delayed. The full scale of losses is not yet grasped. Soviet doctrine emphasizes persistence, and persistence has brought victories elsewhere. There is no precedent for disengaging an operation of this scale without success. To stop now would be to admit failure at the very moment the war appears to be turning. German commanders, by contrast, see the pattern clearly. They are not winning through brilliance or maneuver, but through preparation and discipline. Every Soviet attack reinforces the logic of the defense. Ammunition is expended economically. Positions are held until the last possible moment, then abandoned under cover of fire, leaving nothing of value behind. The forest absorbs the shock. By late December, temperatures plunge further. Weapons seize. Men collapse from exhaustion during attacks and are buried where they fall. Snowdrifts cover wreckage, hiding hazards and dead alike. New assaults must navigate terrain already shaped by destruction. Every step forward is contested. Every pause invites fire. The operation has reached a critical threshold. Soviet reserves are thinning. German reserves, though limited, are committed with precision. The original objective, the destruction of the Ninth Army, feels increasingly distant, almost abstract. What remains is the immediate struggle to survive the next assault, the next barrage, the next night in the open. In the frozen silence between battles, both sides understand something fundamental has shifted. This is no longer a question of breaking through. It is a question of how much blood the ground can absorb before one side can no longer continue. And the answer is approaching faster than anyone, in Moscow, anticipated. By the final days of December 1942, the offensive has consumed its own momentum. The Soviet formations committed at the outset no longer exist in recognizable form. Divisions are reduced to skeletal cadres. Tank corps that once counted hundreds of vehicles now report strength in single digits. Replacement drafts arrive without heavy weapons, without winter clothing sufficient for the temperatures, and often without officers familiar with the units they are joining. They are fed directly into the line, because there is nowhere else to put them. German intelligence begins to recognize the scope of the Soviet commitment. Prisoners speak openly of entire armies thrown forward, of orders that permit no withdrawal. Captured documents confirm the scale of Operation Mars. Yet even now, Model does not assume collapse. He assumes persistence. His orders emphasize containment, not pursuit. Let the enemy expend himself. Let the terrain and the weather do their work. On the ground, the fighting intensifies in confined spaces. Trenches change hands multiple times in a single day. Forest clearings become killing zones measured in meters. At night, flares turn snowfields into stark white stages where movement invites death. Close combat dominates. Bayonets. Grenades thrown blindly through smoke and darkness. Men fight not for objectives on a map, but for holes in the ground that offer a few degrees of warmth and the illusion of safety. Soviet artillery continues to fire, but coordination falters. Observers are killed or cut off. Barrages fall short or long. German positions, hardened and dispersed, absorb the punishment. When the fire lifts, machine guns resume as if uninterrupted. The plan said massed fire would neutralize defenses. Reality delivers a battlefield where firepower alone cannot overcome preparation. By early January 1943, the offensive has reached its breaking point. Weather conditions deteriorate further, grounding aircraft and isolating forward units completely. Supply lines collapse under snow and shellfire. Starvation becomes a factor. Units ration ammunition to a handful of rounds per man. Attacks are postponed, then resumed, then postponed again as commanders struggle to reconcile orders with reality. At the strategic level, events elsewhere begin to intrude. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad is fully encircled and nearing destruction. Soviet success in the south demands consolidation. Resources are finite. Stavka reassesses priorities. Quietly, without announcement, pressure eases along the Azov front. Orders shift from breakthrough to stabilization. The language changes. Words like pause and reorganization replace decisive strike. On the battlefield, the change is felt immediately. Attacks lose their intensity. Assaults become probes. Probes become patrols. German units sense the shift and tighten their grip, launching limited counterattacks to reclaim ground lost in earlier fighting. Soviet troops dig in, often in positions no better than those they assaulted weeks before. The front solidifies into frozen lines scarred by wreckage and grave. The decisive outcome is already sealed, though few yet admit it. Operation Mars has failed to achieve its objectives. The Ninth Army stands. The salient remains. The cost, however, is immense. Casualty figures climb into the hundreds of thousands when wounded, killed, and missing are counted together. Equipment losses are catastrophic, particularly among armored formations that will take months to rebuild. And still, no announcement is made. The fighting subsides not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion. Snow covers the scars. Units are quietly withdrawn. Reports are filed. Files are sealed. The operation fades from public mention even as the war moves on. What happened in the forests west of Azov does not fit the narrative of triumph unfolding elsewhere. And so, for decades, it remains buried beneath the victories that followed, its lessons unspoken, its dead uncounted. The ground keeps its silence. In January and February 1943, the front around Azov appears deceptively calm. The guns fire less often. Large-scale assaults cease. To an outside observer, it might seem that the danger has passed. In reality, the consequences of what has just occurred are only beginning to take shape. The Red Army begins the slow process of reconstruction. Shattered divisions are pulled from the line and merged with others that barely exist themselves. Command staffs are rewritten. After-action reports are compiled with careful language, emphasizing resistance encountered rather than errors made. Lost figures are fragmented across multiple commands, making the true scale difficult to grasp even internally. What cannot be hidden, however, is the depletion of experienced officers and veteran soldiers. Entire cadres forged in earlier campaigns are gone. German Ninth Army emerges from the winter battered but intact. Its defensive success reinforces Model's reputation as a master of elastic defense. The salient still threatens Moscow, but it has also become a liability. It consumes manpower. It demands constant reinforcement. It ties down divisions that cannot be spared elsewhere. Model understands this. So does the German High Command. What the Soviets failed to destroy by force, the Germans will soon abandon by choice. In early March 1943, Operation Bufal is executed with precision. Under cover of deception and controlled withdrawals, Army Group Center evacuates the Arjev, Vyazma salient entirely. Bridges are blown, villages are razed, roads are mined. The withdrawal is orderly, disciplined, and devastating to pursue. When Soviet reconnaissance units advance, they find empty trenches and booby traps instead of resistance. The objective that cost so much blood is suddenly gone. The irony is brutal. The salient falls not to assault, but to calculation. Strategically, the consequences ripple outward. Soviet forces are freed from a threat to Moscow at last, but at a cost that weakens offensive potential elsewhere. German units withdrawn from Arjev are redeployed to form reserves that will soon appear at Kursk. The experience gained in defensive warfare will shape German doctrine for the remainder of the war. For the Red Army, Mars becomes a cautionary shadow behind later successes, a reminder that numbers alone do not guarantee breakthrough. Publicly, the battle barely exists. Soviet communiques emphasize Stalingrad, then Kursk, then the great advances westward. Arjev is mentioned rarely and never in detail. There are no victory parades, no monuments at first. Families receive notices without explanation. Veterans speak cautiously, if at all. The losses are too large, the outcome too ambiguous, the narrative too inconvenient. For decades, historians struggle to reconstruct what happened. Documents are classified. Unit diaries disappear. The operation is mislabeled, minimized, or described as a supporting action rather than a main effort. Only fragmentary accounts emerge, hinting at the scale of the fighting and the ferocity of the defense. The forest keeps most of its secrets. Yet on the ground itself, the evidence never vanished. Even years later, farmers uncover helmets, rifles, fragments of tanks. Bones surface in spring thaws. Entire landscapes remain scarred by trenches and shell holes long after vegetation returns. The silence is not peace, it is accumulation. Operation Mars did not change the war in a single dramatic moment. It shaped it through absence, through forces not available elsewhere, through lessons learned at terrible cost, through a reminder that victory in one sector does not erase disaster in another. The battle west of Arjev stands as one of the most punishing engagements of the Eastern Front, not because it ended the war, but because it revealed the price of misjudgment at the highest level. It showed how preparation can defeat mass, how terrain can become a weapon, how momentum can vanish without warning. And why, for a long time, no one wanted to talk about it. By the time spring arrives in 1943, the forests west of Arjev begin to thaw, and with the thaw comes revelation. Snow recedes from shell craters filled with blackened water. Frozen wrecks of tanks emerge like skeletons. Trenches collapse into muddy scars. Graves, hurriedly dug in winter, are exposed again. What had been hidden by cold is now impossible to ignore. Soviet recovery teams move through the former battlefield, cataloging equipment, marking burial sites, collecting remains where identification is still possible. Many are not. Entire units are listed as missing, their final positions uncertain, their fate inferred only from terrain and debris. Official casualty figures remain conservative. Internal estimates are higher. Later research will place total Soviet losses in Operation Mars well above 300,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. German losses are severe, but proportionally far lower, absorbed by a defense that never broke. Strategically, the consequences crystallize with brutal clarity. The Red Army's failure to destroy the Ninth Army allows German High Command to withdraw on its own terms, conserving experienced divisions. Those divisions reappear months later along the Kursk salient, reinforcing defensive belts that will blunt another massive Soviet offensive before finally yielding. The connection is direct, though rarely acknowledged. Men who survived Arjev fight again at Kursk. Guns saved in winter fire again in summer. Within Soviet doctrine, quiet adjustments follow. Greater emphasis is placed on reconnaissance, artillery coordination, engineer support, and deep operational realism. Later offensives show clearer phasing, improved logistics, and more flexible command structures. These changes are paid for at Arjev, though the receipts are never publicly issued. For the soldiers who fought there, the legacy is personal and permanent. Survivors carry memories of attacks that went nowhere, of orders obeyed despite hopeless odds, of comrades lost not in moments of dramatic breakthrough, but in days of grinding, frozen stalemate. Many speak of Arjev as worse than Stalingrad, not because of scale, but because of meaning. At Stalingrad, suffering leads to victory. At Arjev, suffering leads to silence. That silence lasts for decades. Archives remain closed. Official histories compress months of fighting into paragraphs. Maps omit arrows that point nowhere. The operation is framed as a holding action, a distraction, a necessary pressure applied elsewhere. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union do fuller records emerge, allowing historians to reconstruct the truth in fragments, operational orders, casualty lists, unit diaries that survived by chance. What emerges is not incompetence nor heroism alone, but a portrait of war at its most unforgiving, a plan that made sense within its assumptions, an enemy who prepared better than expected, a terrain that magnified every mistake, a command culture that could not yet afford to admit failure. Operation Mars was not erased because it was small. It was erased because it was large, costly, and unresolved. It did not fit the arc of inevitable advance. It stood as proof that even at the turning point of the war, defeat was still possible. Today, memorials stand where none once existed. Names are carved into stone where they were once lost in snow. The forests have grown back, but the ground remembers. Beneath roots and moss lie the remnants of one of the Eastern Front's bloodiest struggles, a battle fought with absolute commitment and paid for in absolute terms. This was the operation that numbers could not win, preparation could not save, and history could not easily forgive. And for a long time, it was easier not to remember at all. The erasure was never total, it was selective. In the years that follow the war, veterans of the Arjev battles gather quietly, often without uniforms, without medals to display. They recognize one another not by rank or insignia, but by shared memory, by names of villages that no longer exist, by rivers crossed under fire that never made it into official histories. When they speak, it is cautiously, aware that their experience does not align with the story the state prefers to tell. Official narratives crystallize around clear victories. Stalingrad becomes the turning point. Kursk becomes the final test. The road west becomes inevitable. Arjev sits awkwardly between them, demanding explanations that cannot be reduced to triumph. There is no single moment of collapse, no captured field marshal, no encirclement to celebrate. There is only endurance meeting preparation, and preparation prevailing. German records, by contrast, preserve the battle in detail. Unit war diaries describe the defense with clinical precision. Maps show successive lines held and abandoned by design. Casualty lists are grim but controlled. Models' methods are studied, refined, and applied elsewhere. The Arjev experience becomes foundational for German defensive doctrine in 1943 and 1944, even as the strategic situation deteriorates. For historians, the reconstruction is slow, dispersed documents, conflicting figures, survivors agging into silence. Only with time does the scale become undeniable. Operation Mars was not a footnote. It was one of the largest offensives of the war, launched with expectations equal to those at Stalingrad, and met with a resistance that shattered those expectations completely. The human cost defies abstraction. Hundreds of thousands of men entered the forests west of Arjev and never returned. Many have no known grave. Their names are recorded, if at all, on lists without context. Their deaths are not tied to a victory, only to an effort that failed to achieve its aim. Yet without that effort, later successes might have been different, harder, slower, more costly still. History often remembers wars through breakthroughs and conclusions. Arjev reminds us that wars are also shaped by dead ends, by battles that consume strength without yielding ground, by decisions made with incomplete information and carried through because turning back seems impossible. This operation was erased not because it did not matter, but because it mattered too much in the wrong way. It exposed the limits of mass without mastery. It revealed the price of underestimating a prepared enemy. It showed that even at the moment of rising momentum, defeat could still be inflicted with devastating efficiency. And beneath the trees, beneath the rebuilt villages and quiet roads, the evidence remains. Not of victory, but of truth. In the end, what defines the operation west of Argev is not a single decision or a single day, but accumulation of assumptions layered atop intelligence, of doctrine applied against terrain that rejected it, of pressure applied until pressure itself became the weapon used against the attacker. For the Red Army, the experience leaves scars deeper than casualty lists. Commanders who survive carry the memory forward. They remember what happens when reconnaissance is rushed, when artillery is insufficiently synchronized, when armor is committed without freedom to maneuver. They remember how quickly numerical advantage dissolves inside forests and swamps. These lessons quietly inform later operations, shaping the way fronts are prepared, the way breakthroughs are staged, the way reserves are held back rather than consumed all at once. For the German army, Argev confirms a hard truth already sensed, but not yet proven so completely. Defense, properly prepared, can neutralize superiority in men and machines. Time can be turned into a weapon. Space can be traded for survival. Model's methods echo later at Kursk, along the Dnieper, in Normandy, and even in the final battles inside Germany itself. Argev is not an anomaly. It is a template. Strategically, the battle changes the war by subtraction rather than addition. Forces destroyed here are forces unavailable elsewhere. Divisions shattered here do not advance as quickly later. Momentum delayed here must be rebuilt at enormous cost. Even victory at Stalingrad does not erase that reality. The Eastern Front moves west, but not as fast as it might have. The war lengthens. The killing continues. And still, for years, the name Argev carries no weight beyond the map. Only gradually does recognition arrive. Monuments are raised. Archives are opened. Historians begin to speak openly of what happened in the winter of 1942 and 1943. The phrase Argev meat grinder enters the vocabulary, stark and unforgiving. It is not poetic, it is precise. The operation was erased because it challenged the idea of inevitability. It reminded everyone that victory was not preordained, that even at the turning point of the war, catastrophe remained possible. It showed that courage alone is not enough, that sacrifice without success still leaves a debt that must be acknowledged. Today, standing in those forests, there is little to suggest the scale of what occurred. Birds move through branches where shells once burst. Snow falls where fire once dominated every horizon. But beneath the surface, the ground is layered with memory, steel fragments, bone, silence earned at a terrible price. This was not a forgotten battle by accident. It was forgotten because remembering it requires honesty. About planning, about limits, about the cost of being wrong. And yet, the silence that followed Argev was never complete. Fragments of the battle seeped into memoirs, into letters, into the quiet recollections of men who could never articulate the full weight of what they endured. In those recollections are details the archives hide. The way frostbite crept through socks and gloves, how artillery fell like winter rain that never stopped, how comrades vanished without a trace when the snow covered them. Families at home received telegrams, terse and formulaic, not in capture, missing, or killed in action. Rarely did those messages convey context. They could not communicate the struggle for a single slope of forest broken only by shell craters. They could not explain the hours spent advancing 20 meters under fire that never lessened. They could not make sense of orders that demanded relentless assault without room to maneuver. In training schools after the war, instructors referenced Argev sparingly, and when they did, the emphasis was on caution. Never underestimate the defender. Always probe deeply before committing armor. Prioritize logistics and reconnaissance above all. These teachings shaped a generation of Soviet commanders who would later face the bitter challenges of Korea and beyond. Argev became a case study, not of triumph, but of hardened operational wisdom. Across the former front, the landscape itself began to change. Villages once obliterated by battle were rebuilt. Roads were laid over ground churned by tanks and artillery. Forests grew thicker, obscuring the scars beneath. Yet farmers, digging post-war fields, still unearthed the remnants of war, shards of shell, broken helmets, rusted bayonets. Each discovery was a reminder that the cost of Mars had never fully vanished. It had merely been buried. As archives opened in the latter decades of the 20th century, historians pieced together operational orders, casualty reports, and unit diaries. They discovered staggering figures that defied earlier official accounts. They mapped movements that revealed how close some penetrations had come to success before collapsing under counter-pressure. They reconstructed the mind-numbing complexity of coordinating multi-front offensives across unforgiving terrain in winter. In doing so, a new generation of scholarship emerged, one that acknowledged Argev not as a footnote, but as a defining struggle that tested the limits of Soviet operational art. Veterans' associations formed, and anniversaries brought gatherings of men whose hair had long since grayed. They shared stories that overlapped, contradicted, and complemented one another. They remembered units, regiments, commanders whose names were long absent from official histories. They placed flowers at memorials erected by local communities, determined that the dead not be forgotten. Their voices contributed to a fuller narrative, one that balanced sacrifice with critique, valor with consequence. In Germany, post-war analysis of the Ninth Army's conduct at Argev informed military doctrine in a very different context. Defense in depth, flexible response, decentralized command. These principles derived not just from theory, but from lived experience in battles like this one. German officers who survived used these lessons in NATO training, in Cold War planning, in shaping a new Bundeswehr conditioned by the horrors of the past. Global military historians came to recognize Argev as more than an Eastern Front engagement. It became a case study in operational risk, in the relationship between intelligence assessments and battlefield reality, in the human limits of attrition warfare. It stood beside other brutal battles, Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, not in scale alone, but in its testimony to the grinding nature of industrialized combat. Yet for all this recognition, the battle remains difficult to narrate to those unfamiliar with its geography or its stakes. There is no towering fortress to visit, no single day of decisive breakthrough, no dramatic encirclement ending in surrender. What there is instead is a montage of frozen forests, shattered villages, rivers slick with ice and blood, and men who fought without ever reaching the promised breakthrough. And perhaps that is why it was erased for so long. Because it refuses to be simplified. Because it does not fit neatly into arcs of inevitable victory. Because it demands confrontation with failure as much as with heroism. In the quiet of a century that would see millions of pages written about the Second World War, Operation Mars stands apart. It is a testament to the complexity of war and to the cost of assumptions made under pressure. It is an indictment of plans that disregard terrain, weather, and the depth of enemy preparation. It is, above all, a memorial to those who fought not for triumph, but for survival. If memory is measured by acknowledgement, then Argev was forgotten, because remembering it required honesty about loss without redemption. But history does not allow true erasure. It insists, even decades later, that we confront what happened. That we see not only battles won, but battles that shaped the course of war through endurance and cost. That we understand the price paid not only in territory gained, but in men irrevocably changed. History remembers, because forgetting would dishonor the scale of what was endured. And when we look upon the forests west of Argev today, quiet, unremarkable, green once more, we must also see beneath the surface the echoes of winter artillery, the frozen footprints of infantrymen, the outlines of tanks swallowed by snow. We must see not just what the operation was meant to achieve, but what it truly became. A testament to the brutal arithmetic of war, and a reminder that even the greatest offensives can be undone not by a single moment, but by the accumulation of countless moments in which reality insists upon its own unforgiving truth. By the time the last documents are unsealed and the last veterans speak, the shape of the truth is no longer in doubt. What was erased was not a minor setback, not a failed probe, not a diversionary strike. It was a full-scale strategic offensive launched with confidence, executed with determination, and broken by a reality that refused to bend. Operation Mars reveals how modern war punishes certainty. Intelligence assessed weakness where strength had been deliberately built. Doctrine assumed momentum where terrain enforced stagnation. Numerical superiority was committed into spaces that converted mass into vulnerability. The plan demanded speed. The battlefield imposed delay. Between those two forces, entire armies were consumed. The human cost cannot be softened by context. Soldiers advanced knowing the odds were shrinking. Officers issued orders aware that losses would be extreme. Medics worked in conditions where survival itself was uncertain. None of them controlled the assumptions made far above their level. All of them paid for those assumptions in frozen ground. Strategically, the operation altered the balance of the Eastern Front in ways that are still measured today. It delayed Soviet advances. It preserved German formations long enough to influence later battles. It reshaped doctrine on both sides. It demonstrated that victory in one sector does not negate disaster in another. War does not average outcomes. It compounds them. And yet from this failure came adaptation. The Red Army learned, adjusted, hardened. Later offensives would show improved coordination, deeper reconnaissance, more disciplined use of reserves. The cost of that learning was paid at Argev, quietly, completely, without celebration. This is why the operation vanished from official memory for decades, not because it lacked heroism, but because it exposed vulnerability. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was undeniable. It forced an admission that even at the moment of strategic reversal, when the tide of war began to turn, catastrophe was still possible. Remembering Argev means accepting that victory is not clean, that progress is uneven, that some of the most important battles are those that do not end in triumph, but in understanding. The forests west of Argev do not announce themselves. They do not demand attention. But beneath them lies one of the Eastern Front's greatest truths. Wars are not only won by breakthroughs. They are shaped by what breaks first. And sometimes, what breaks is certainty itself.